everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex. In this week's episode, we are saying one final goodbye to Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Doing one final spelunking through the caves, just checking in on where the format has settled in its final weeks, the differences in how you might want to approach the format today compared to how you approached it week 1, 2, or 3 of the draft, and just in general, some edges I think you can gain on opponents who might be still approaching this format like it's week 1 or 2 where you're just supposed to be drafting Jeskai all the time. A big motivator for me talking about this topic for this episode today is, of course, there's an Arena Open happening this weekend. I figured this type of episode would be nice for those who are planning to play in it, especially those who maybe haven't played since week 1, 2, or 3, just to get you up to speed, get you recalibrated on where the format is. But even if you're not planning to play in the Open, I think a lot of what we talk about is definitely just going to be applicable to drafting in the best of 1 or best of 3 queues. And just to give you a quick preview of what we're in for today, as with most of my deep dives, I'm going to give you some broad thoughts on the format, where it's landed. I want to revisit some of the archetypes and where they stand, especially some of the lesser drafted ones. But I think one thing that people might find the most helpful is I have a hearty handful of cards I want to talk about that weren't cards that you looked at or even cared about really in the early days of the format, but they are cards that you should consider now and understand where some of these lesser or more narrow cards might go, because you don't always get 23 awesome cards these days. The format's a lot scrappier now, and it's really easy to dismiss the cards that you looked at week 1 and week 2 and labeled those bad cards. Sort of want to just draw your eyes to those cards that aren't just generically awesome and are going to go in every deck, but do have a home if you know where to look for them. And a quick note before we jump in, if you like the show, if you feel like you've gotten something out of it, if you've leveled up somewhere, you want to give back, go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limited level up. The support we get over there is how we keep the show running. It's how I've been able to do this as long as I have. And for your benefit, there's a bunch of rewards we want to give back to you, especially relevant at this time in the set release cycle. Murders of Karlov Manor just around the corner. The beginning of a new set's probably the best time to take advantage of those rewards. Get you ahead of the curve of the drafting population. So yeah, go check it out if you want to support or want those benefits. All right, let's jump in to the cave, I guess. So unlike a format overview or like a state of the format episode that I do at the beginning of a set, I'm going to mostly assume that if you're watching or listening to this episode, you've played Ixalan, you know the format, you have a good idea what's going on. I'm not going to start from the ground up. I'm also going to be taking things at like a bit of a snappier pace than I usually do. I'm going to be jumping around from topic to topic a little bit. In line with that, throughout this episode, I've peppered in a few like 1 or 2 minute segments I'm calling quick hits. And these are just little helpful tips, little packages of ideas that I slid in. Ideas that I didn't feel deserved like a 5 or 10 minute segment alone, but I think are important. And if you can internalize these quick hits just alone, I think you're going to be well on your way to understanding my view of the format. Think of it almost like a Family Guy cutaway gag. I'm going to go with that, where it's like, you know, not exactly relevant to exactly what we're talking about, but will be tangential, and we'll loop it back around to our main topic. And so anytime I say, here's a quick hit, especially if you're kind of just passively listening to this episode or maybe using it as some background noise, I would peel my ears for those bits, because I think those are some real salient points I'm going to touch on. And so to kick us off, here's our first quick hit, and I just want to talk about Sealed very quickly, because if you're playing the Open this weekend, you're going to have to play Sealed. And the good news is that I don't think this Sealed format is very different from the draft format. Like, there's some Sealed formats where just like the composition of packs and the mechanics and maybe different slots in the packs kind of have your Sealed pools looking sort of different than your draft decks. I don't really think that's the case for this Sealed format. I think that a lot of my pools just, I'm trying to build them and replicate what a draft deck would look like. You know, all the same Sealed general advice you hear applies here. It's a tick slower, not a lot slower, but half a turn slower. Your mana can be like slightly sketchier so you can get in those bombs, the best cards in your pool. If you're not familiar with like what I mean by like, your typical Sealed things, I have a lot of other episodes where I've touched on those Sealed tips. So you can just like search on the podcast feed or on the YouTube, just Limited Level Up Sealed or something like that. Also, there's like a bunch of other resources. You don't have to go to specifically my stuff, but it's all kind of the same stuff if you have played before, if you kind of know the idea of Sealed. Like, another thing is your 23rd playable might be something like Walk the Ancestors, right? Like the 5 mana buy something back, discover 4, which is a card that, you'll play once in a while on draft, but you're not that happy about it. I think in Sealed, you're a little more happy about it. It's that sort of thing. So really, if you're worried about the Sealed portion, you're like, I haven't done any Sealed practice, I would say as long as you've done a lot of drafts, you're going to have a good idea what the cards are. You're going to have a good idea of what you want to construct your deck like. One small thing I would say is plan to be able to spend mana a little bit longer than you would in draft, right? And this is a general Seal tip. This isn't like, oh man, this format specifically. But since the games are going to go on average like a turn or two longer, that means you want to be equipped to be able to keep spending mana. So maybe you play that third Another Chance. Maybe you play that second Nurturing Bristleback, the 7 mana green Dino Cycler. I guess a way to put it is, if you're deciding should I have that one more top end card or put in a cheaper, lower impact card, probably lean towards the top end card, unless of course you open up a good aggro pool, which is not going to be too uncommon. Honestly, like, good aggro pools definitely exist, and as the non-aggro pool builder, you need to be accounting for that. You have to still make sure you have a good curve, but if you are like, well, should I put in that one more top end, that one more grindy card, I would say probably lean towards yes. A second quick hit here, we're starting with 2 back-to-back, is just talking about the environment of competitive drafts a bit more, but also just the environment of drafts on week 12 of a format. We're not quite week 12, I think it's like week 10 or something like that, but the idea being, when you're drafting with other good players or other players that you're more confident that are good, that should change your approach to draft a little bit, or at very least change what you expect to see in the draft. Because the big picture idea I have here is basically just, when you're in a competitive draft or in a late stage format draft, you know the people at the table aren't going to be passing a lot of good cards, right? They're going to be taking the good cards. They know what the good cards are. They're not going to be passing you 7th pick a Goblin Tomb Raider or 8th pick Ultec Cloudguard like you see in the early weeks of the format. You can sort of think of this as the self-correcting nature of draft is a little more relevant in competitive events, because on Arena, the idea that draft is self-correcting is sometimes kind of not true, because it's only self-correcting if people know what the good cards are, they take those early, and then leave the not so good cards, the less desirable cards later, so that people can pick up what other people are putting down, right? If you never get to that point, and the people you're drafting with don't ever take the good cards, draft doesn't self-correct. So in a competitive event, things are going to be self-correcting a little bit more. You should, like, quote-unquote draft the hard way, if that's the approach you want to go for. There's also the other approach of, like, well, I know how to draft this deck excellent. I know how to draft green-red dinos. I'm just going to force it. Yeah, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and if it works, it's going to be awesome. There's also that approach, too. I think that's totally valid. But if you are more into reading the signals, drafting the hard way, this is where you want to apply it. In a competitive setting, be very vigilant. Be very lucid in your drafting, right? Don't just lock in. Think about what's coming to you, note what's coming to you, figure out if you're in a seat that you can keep on doing what you're doing. Like, I guess the way I would put it is, if you start blue-red, you first pick a Captain Storm, and you're like, okay, great, I've got a good start. Blue-red's a great deck. Don't just lock it in right there. Don't lock it in pick 4 even. Don't lock it in pick 5 even, because you're not going to always get that deck, especially a very desirable deck like blue-red. And just in general, your decks in these competitive settings, or just late stage drafts, late stages of the format drafts, they're going to be a little bit less streamlined, or they're going to be a little bit less all the 1s, all the 2s. People are going to be fighting for the cheap cards, which means that if you're drafting an aggro deck and you're like, okay, I've started red-white, let's just say, don't just be like, all right, I'm red-white and I'm going to draft my aggro deck and I'm just going to expect to see the cheap cards. If you're not seeing the cheap cards that you need for an aggro deck, you're not seeing the 1s, the guide wings, the goblins, you're not seeing the good 2s, you probably have to pivot to something like, maybe not a different color pair, but you maybe have to go up the curve a little bit. If your aggro deck's not coming together, you're in the middle of pack 2 and you're like, hey, I've only got 5 cheap cards here. Maybe you pick up like Tinkerer's Totes and the ones that are Sunshot Militias, and you're more of a mid-range, grind you out. Maybe you pick up some Altasaurs, some 5-drops, some 6-drops even. I said a second ago that these drafts are a little bit less streamlined, and a little bit, your synergies come together a little bit less often, because you don't always get the pieces you need. And an aggro deck at its core is a synergy deck, right? It's a synergy deck where your synergy pieces are a bunch of 1-drops and a bunch of 2-drops, and if you're not getting those, just like if you're drafting like a black-red sacrifice decks and you're like, oh no, I'm not getting the steal and sack, I'm not getting the active treason plus the sack outlets, it's not coming together. You should think about that for your aggro decks too. If it's not coming together, you should probably move a little bit bigger up the curve, because a bad aggro deck is just going to fold to pretty much anything. All right, let's move into just talking about the format at a glance for a while. Just talking about the archetypes, where I think they've landed early on in the format. Like, and like I've said, Jeskai, the blue-red, white-red, and white-blue decks, those are clearly the best. But I think there's been a bit of a shift. I think that blue-red, definitely still one of the best decks for sure. Blue-white I like too. But I've actually bumped out white-red out of my top tier and replaced it with green-red dinosaurs. I do think green-red is like one of the best decks in the format. I think it's great. I think you can draft it as like a super aggro deck, or a little bit more of a mid-rangey going up the curve with, I was mentioning the Altasaurs, the 4/5 that taps to deal 2. You can have that kind of package where you're just like, okay, a little bit of aggression early, and then come in with the heavy hitters after. And my reasoning for bumping down white-red is, I think it's just like a little bit too in the middle. With blue-red, it's super explosive, right? The starts I'm talking about, where they go Goblin Tomb Raider into Captain Storm into something that makes an artifact or even 2 artifacts, and just go off and really start to flood the board with counters and cheap creatures. Blue-red is the fastest deck in the format, and I think actually if I'm to call a best deck, I would say blue-red is the best deck. And then blue-white, you know, you got the opposite end of the spectrum where it's a good control deck. You're just gumming up the board, maybe pecking in with some cheap flyers, and then flipping your craft cards to win the game. With white-red, I feel like I'm always torn a little bit between the two, right? It's not quite as explosive as the blue-red decks, and it doesn't have quite as good of a late game as the blue-white decks. So you're stuck in the middle a little bit. I'm not saying it's a bad deck. I still really like white-red. I would not shy away from drafting it at all if I thought it was open. But if I'm going to shoot for the stars, it is more going to be for one of those like tier 1 decks, blue-red, blue-white, or red-green. So these top tier decks, ideally, this is where I end up this weekend. If I could choose, I would be drafting one of these decks, and I would be very happy to if the table lets me. But by no means are these decks the only ones I'm happy to be in, because one of the biggest format shifts that I felt compared to the beginning of the format and now is that, another quick hit, listen up, black is totally fine. I think that black, not that it got a bad rap unnecessarily early in the format or undeservedly, I do think black is still the worst color, but it's not a bad color. And it's the worst color, which kind of hurt it early in the format, because black as a color specifically, when it's a little bit weaker than the other colors, it becomes actually a lot weaker, I believe, because I think the dynamic, what's at play here, is you've got a lot of drafters that maybe aren't paying too much attention to the set. They're just jumping in the queues and drafting. And a very appealing type of card for those players is just good black removal spells, like kill a creature, give something -5, -5. Those are easy, clear first picks that you can be like, hey, that's a good card. And what happens a lot of times is you have these drafters first picking stuff like Join the Dead, holding on for dear life, overdrafting black. In general, I believe black gets overdrafted in most formats. So when you have a format like LCI, where black is not very good, and you have a bunch of people first picking black cards and just holding on to dear life, another thing at play is less experienced players tend not to pivot as much as a more experienced player. They'll just be holding on to dear life for the black cards, and you have 4 people at the table fighting for not so great black cards. But here's where the self-correcting nature of draft does really come in. Yes, black is the weakest color, but it's not a bad color because people know not to take black cards early, not to just take a removal spell, hold into dear life. You're going to start to get stuff like Deathcap Marionette, Tithing Blade, Another Chance, Deadweight. You'll see those cards mid-pack generally if you're drafting at a table where people are kind of in the know and they know what they're doing. And you're going to have that this weekend, I believe, where people are going to know that, hey, I shouldn't just be first picking black cards, black commons. Maybe you move in for a bomb or a rare or something. That's definitely a good idea. But if you're in that seat where you open up the good black rare, I would just take it and be pretty happy to move into black. You're also going to benefit from the fact that some people at your table might be coming from week 1 or 2 of the format, playing this format for the first time in a while, and might have that mindset of like, oh yeah, black isn't so good. I think most people won't have that mindset, but you might get lucky and have the table and black is just wide open to you. So what I would say, and we're going to get into this a little bit later as we get into how to draft the black decks and what you're really looking for. If you're not up to speed on how to draft the black decks, if you still feel like it's kind of foreign territory, well, number one, stay tuned because we're going to talk about it. I'm going to definitely be covering this later in the episode. But also, I'm going to point you to the resources I generally will point people to. 17 lands. Look at the trophy lists over there. See what people are winning with, what their successful black decks look like. Look at the win rates of the black commons just to get a general feel for, the ones you want to take, the ones you want to avoid. Because I do think there are actually quite a few kind of like trap-ish looking black commons that aren't actually good. And if you haven't had that experience with the black decks, you might fall into those traps. And I will try to point those out as well. But I do really think it's important to have this tool in your tool belt if you want to be successful this weekend. Because if you open up an Aclazotz, like the mythic, the 4/4 flyer giant god thing that's ridiculous, what are you going to do? Not take it? No, of course you're going to, and you're going to want to know what cards you want to pair with it. And that's going to bring us to the next tier of decks here, which are the black Descend decks, which are black, green, and blue, black. And I've been drafting a lot of these decks lately, partially because I think they're pretty open. And I think if you are playing them right, if you're playing the right black cards, and again, we're going to get to construction of these decks, because these are some of the lesser decks that people have not had experience with. When we get into the archetypes, I'm not really going to break down the Jeskai decks. You know how to draft those. But we will do a bit of a deep dive on these black decks. And I've had pretty good success with them. If you've been watching Sam Black's stream, he's been having good success with these decks all format. But of course, he's Sam Black, and this is kind of his wheelhouse. And with these grindy black decks, I do think of them sort of as cave decks as well. Caves is another, it's been the talk of this entire format. Is it good? Is it bad? What do you need to make it work? How many payoffs do you have? Like, this has been kind of this like gray area where I feel like people don't have a consensus really. Like, I think a lot of people are like, no, this is trash, I'm never going to draft it. And then there's some people who are like, Caves is all I wanted to do, right? So where's the middle ground? I've personally come around on Caves as a package in your deck if it is open at the table. It's something that gives your black decks a little bit of grind, especially just having a bunch of those hidden lands, like the hidden caves, means that you're drawing action in the late game, your opponents are just drawing their basic lands. It really ties into what black wants to do, is just grind at the game, attrition at the game. So I'm not all in on Caves. I'm not saying like, ooh, it's the secret tech, you gotta draft it. But I do think I'm entertaining the idea of Caves more these days, slotting it in as a package in my black deck. And like I said, we're going to get into specifics when we get to them. Then we have three sort of outlier oddball decks in green-white, black-white, and blue-green. And I see them sort of in the same tier as the black decks. These are oddballs. Like I said, another one we're going to go a little bit deeper on later, but not undraftable by any means. I think I played all of these decks to good success. Not decks I was ending up in very often at the beginning of the format, but as I played more, you end up in them if you're just reading the open colors. And then the one deck that I do think you should not draft is black-red. The reason being that black and red are just doing completely opposite things. Red is very aggressive, black is very controlling, and you've got all these cards that I think are kind of aimed towards black-red, like Deep Goblin Skull Taker, that's the 3-mana 2/2 menace that grows when you descend, Canonized in Blood, like the black enchantment that when you descend you put a counter on something, Bloodthorn Flail, the single black equipment that you have to discard a card or pay 3 to equip it. Like, all these cards that kind of trick you into thinking there's this more aggressive version of this black descend deck, and I just don't think it's there. All of these cards just suck. Like, to be blunt about it, they're all underrated. They all don't really work the way you want them to. I've just seen so many people drafting black-red, and honestly, I actually feel like a little bit bad because these cards, I'm sure, kind of looked appealing if you haven't played with the set a bunch, but they are truly trap cards. I do not think they work very well. The one time I think you can draft black-red is if you're a black grindy deck, because black decks are grindy. They're only grindy. You can't be aggressive with black, and you're using red just for its removal, like a Braids or a bomb you might pick up, like a Magmatic Galleon. If you're pairing your black grindy things with red as an open color, and you just get like generically good cards, not the aggro cards, but good removal spells, good value cards, I think that's like the very narrow sliver of decks that I would say, yeah, that's a good black-red deck. I've only seen that deck come together once. I've never drafted it myself. I've only seen it on the opposite side of the battlefield. So as much as I was saying, yeah, like pick up what other people are putting down, draft the open colors, black-red, I think, is the one you want to stay away from. And it's going to bring us to another quick hit here, and that quick hit is speculate on fixing late in the pack. There's a lot of great single-color bombs in this format. All those 3-mana bombs, the Kitesail Arsonist, the Preacher of the Schisms, that laundry list of extremely cheap single-pip bombs. You're going to get those cards passed to you sometimes. You're going to open those cards sometimes, and they're going to be massive upgrades on your 23rd, 22nd card, right? Like, this point in the format, when things are a little scrappier, usually your last few cards aren't so good. When your decks are more streamlined, you should push away from splashing because you just want that consistency. But as the decks are a little bit scrappier, you see a late Sunbird Standard or a Promising Vein or a Captivating Cave. I've been taking those over just mid-level playables or low-tier playables. Like, as you get to the end of the pack, it can kind of be easy to autopilot. Just like, okay, take a card of my color, take a card of my color. But you're taking, like, Malmit Brawler, right? The green 2-drop, which is like, fine, but you probably won't need that card. Sunbird Standard, which is the uncommon mana rock that crafts to turn into a flyer. That card almost always wheels. Captivating Caves go pretty late. Promising Veins even go pretty late. So just be on the lookout for these. Keep your eye out for them. Don't take mid-level playables over them because you're going to be very happy when you get past the Polani's Hatcher and you get to play that card. All right, and that's going to bring us to talking about some archetypes and some specifics on how you want to build them. Like I mentioned, I'm not going to talk about the Jeskai decks. You know how to draft those. I'm sure you've drafted them or seen people draft them. There's also a bunch of other resources out there. You don't need me telling you how to draft those Jeskai decks. We are going to start with black, though. And when I say black, I'm talking black-green, black-blue, black-white as well, because I think black-white can be kind of a grindy control deck, but mostly the Descend decks, black-green and black-blue. First question to answer is probably why. Why would you want to draft a black deck? And number one, you might be at a table where black is very open, people haven't gotten the memo that it's a draftable color, but the more likely reason is you open up a good rare. I think black actually has the most good rares out of all the colors. For example, just to run down a quick list here, Aclazotz, Bloodletter of Aclazotz is another mythic, Corpses of the Lost, Starving Revenant, which is the 4-mana 4/4 that ETBs draw some cards. Then if you're at Descend 8, you start draining your opponent every time you draw a card, kind of like a mini Shieldred. Terror Tide, which is the 2 black Wrath that gives -X, wrecks the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. Preacher to the Schism is the 3 mana 2/4 death touch that when it attacks, it either makes a vampire or you draw a card. Bringer of the Last Gift, which is the 8 mana demon that reanimates everything from the graveyard. It's a really great build around. I would also group in Throne of the Grim Captain in this category as a black rare, because I think when you're doing Throne of the Grim Captain stuff, you want to be in black generally. And some kind of like honorary rares here that will get you into black that are as good as some of those rares I mentioned. Deep Cavern Bat, which is the 2 mana 1/1 flying lifelink that comes in and takes a card from your opponent's hand and they don't get it back until they kill the bat. And Chupacabra Echo, which is the 2 black 3/2, comes in, gets something -X, where X is the number of permanents in your grave. So you've got a lot of really, really great high rarity cards. I've had situations where I've opened a great rare, taken it, and then gone past another great rare. Obviously, that's a good start to a draft. And the thing, I'm specifically talking about the rares here, not just because this is a way you get into drafting black, a reason to draft black, but specifically the main game plan of black is just to recur its great cards. Survive early, cast its bombs, then recur its bombs. So all those cards I just listed, those are huge priorities. But then your next priority when you're drafting black is another chance. This is the 3 mana instant, mill 2, and then you can take 2 creatures from your graveyard, put it in your hand. This is your card advantage tool. This is one of your main ways to grind out the game. Buying back a Chupacabra Echo, buying back a bat, playing an awesome rare, and then your opponent kills it and you get it back is really demoralizing for them. And I think this is actually a legitimately good strategy. And it sounds rare to be like, oh yeah, you need these rares, that's part of Black's game plan. But because they're so prevalent, there's so many good ones, and because you do get them past some amount of the time, I think like it's not like this weird thing that happens once in a blue moon. This is a pretty consistent thing that happens to you when you draft black. You just end up with a few rares, and then your game plan is just like grind up the game, recur them. Of course, that grind up the game, recur them kind of part of the game plan, that comes later. You do need the early defense. Luckily, Black's commons, while they're not very good at closing the game, they're excellent at keeping you alive. Tithing Blade, Dead Weight, Deathcat Marionette, Echo of Dusk, Join the Dead. Like, you've got all of these cheap cards at common that you will get access to if black is open, and they do their job really, really well. Like, a good black deck, I'll look at and it has, 2 Dead Weights, 2 Blades, 2 Deathcat Marionettes, and you just think, I'm never dying early here. And when you're never dying early, you just want some way to convert that into some way to win in the late game. And even if you're not so lucky as to have multiple rares or even one really great one, you could just recur like a big green creature or some blue cards that draw cards or blue flyers or something. Like, that's sort of a plan B. You would like to have those rares or the Chupacabra Echo or the bat. But even if you don't, that core, that shell of the cheap commons that keep you alive, plus another chance recurring your best cards, that's gonna work in pretty much every deck with just big creatures, with just good creatures, good quality creatures that you'll pick up on the way. A card I want to call out as not embarrassing and quite playable is Ray of Ruin. This is the 5 mana sorcery, exile target creature, vehicle, or non-basic land, and then you scry 1. I bet you couldn't recite that off of memory if I said, what does Ray of Ruin do? What are the 3 things that it can target? I think most people probably get 2, but forget one of them. I mean, until the other day, I actually couldn't. I forgot that it exiled vehicles. But anyways, the idea with this card looks very, very clunky, but when so much of your early game, especially at common, is just gumming up the ground, creating a board stall, you don't mind a clunkier removal spell. Like, a clunky removal spell is really bad when you're already going to be behind early. But in your black decks, you can keep pace. Like, you don't fall that far behind. So when you're gumming up the board, your opponent's going to inevitably play something good, a good rare of their own. This is a pretty nice catch-all card that you get pretty late. You get close to the wheel or on the wheel, and I wouldn't mind playing 2 copies of this card. Also, a small little package my black decks often have is just a little defossilize package. Defossilize being the 5 mana reanimation spell that when you reanimate a creature, that creature explores twice. You want to combo these with the land cyclers, the dinosaurs, nurturing bristleback, rampaging spiketail, getting those back on turn 5, especially with bristleback, right? That's a nice little thing in green black specifically. We're getting back bristleback, which is the 5/5, comes with a 3/3 token. Like, I think this is the best of the dinosaurs to reanimate. And then just looking at some specifics of blue black and green black. Blue black, there's another good rare that will pull you into this archetype in the Ancient One. This is one that you don't see very often. It's a mythic. Blue black for an 8/8. But it can't attack or block until you have Descend 8, and has the ability 2 black, blue, draw a card, and then discard a card. And then when you discard a card this way, target player mills cards equal to its mana value. Kind of a weird looking card, but if you are a dedicated Descend deck, this turns on pretty consistently by like turn 5-ish. And that ability to draw a card and then discard a card and you mill somebody, that's really good, not just for turning this on if you don't have Descend 8, you really only need one activation generally, especially if you're pitching like a 6-mana land cycler. But this kills them pretty quickly too. A card that's great in blue-black is Sage of Days. This is the 3 and a blue 3/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you can look at the top 3 cards of your library and then put any number of those in your graveyard or one of them back on top. This is a card that if the set was all about descending, all about filling your graveyard, I actually think this would be a top common. Of course, it panned out, it wasn't like that, but when you are in these decks, this is one of the best ways to fill your yard early, so you can turn on your Zen cards pretty quickly, and also still affect the board, right? You're not just casting another chance early, milling 2, not affecting the board. So do look at Sage of Days as a pretty good card for blue-black. And then one more that's also a pretty good playable, Didact Echo. This is the 5-mana 3/2 in black that ETBs draws a card. When you have Descend 4, it has flying. Not one of the better top-end cards, but certainly a playable one. Definitely gets the job done if you need a little bit more grind, a little bit more top-end. And then there's Ukmenbach, which is the gold signpost uncommon. This is the 3 blue-black 6/4 Vigilant Menace, and if you have Descend 8, you can pay 6 mana to bring it back from the graveyard one time. This is a fine card. I don't ever prioritize it. You often wheel it too. This isn't really what I'm counting on for my finisher. I prefer those rares or some other creatures, but it's passable. Just don't think you have to prioritize this card. And then some green-black specifics. Koti Scavenger. So this is the 3-mana 3/2, and if you have Descend 4, you can bring back a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. This is a card that is great in green-black, and I splash it quite a bit in blue-black as well. It doesn't quite create a loop with another chance. Like, it's not like one of those things where it's like, Scavenger gets back your another chance gets back Scavenger. Of course, you can't get back another chance with the Koti Scavenger, but just being able to buy back something from the graveyard once, and then buying back the Scavenger plus something else, and then Scavenger buying back something else, that's a lot of grind, that's a lot of value, really gives you that inevitability that these kind of decks need. Mineshaft Spider. This is an important one. This is the 4-mana 3/4 reach creature that comes in mills 2 cards. Great Descent Enabler, great blocker, blocks all the flyers, and another card that you get pretty late, mid-pack or later in the pack. There's Basking Capybara. This is the 2-mana 1/3 that if you have Descend 4 gets +3/+0. Not a card I prioritize in these decks, but if you need it too, this is definitely a passable 2 as long as you have the self-mill to turn this into a 3/4 at a pretty reasonable turn. Like maybe if you think you can turn this on by turn 5 or 6, yeah, I wouldn't mind playing this card. And then there's Akawali, which is the gold uncommon, which is a 3-mana 3/3. If you have Descend 4, it gets +2/+2 trample. Descend 8, another +2/+2, and can't be blocked by more than one creature. Sort of like Ukmenbach, where I don't really prioritize this card. You can play it. It's probably slightly above average, but not one I think you need to prioritize. I've got 2 example decks here, one of a blue-black base deck and one of a green-black base deck. For those listening audio only, I'll try my best to spell out what's going on here. With this blue-black deck we're going to take a look at here, you'll see that the 2-drop slot is pretty full. Like, I do have quite a few 2-drops, about 10 of them. Not all of them affect the board, like 2 inverted icebergs in there. But I've got Deathcap Marionette, Shipwreck Sentry, the 2-mana 3/3 Pirate Defender, 2 Staunch Crewmates, the 2-mana uncommon, look at the top 4, take a pirate or an artifact, 2 Tithing Blades. So that's the kind of setup you kind of want. I actually would prefer maybe, a Deadweight in there, maybe one more card that affected the board. But then you go up the curve, some removal. I'm splashing out Koti Scavenger in this deck, like I mentioned. And then the top end, how I'm actually closing out the game. Well, I mentioned that I have 2 inverted icebergs. Those are pretty good ways to turn the corner, but I've also got a little bit of a cave package here. I've got 2 hidden necropolises, I've got a captivating cave, I've got a promising vein, so 4 caves, plus a sinuous Benthasar, which is the blue cave payoff that draws cards. I've got Gargantuan Leech, which is the 5/5 lifelink. I've got Cosmium Confluence, which is the rare that puts counters on your caves. I've got Defossilize to reanimate some of my good things. I got a Rampaging Spiketail in there as a Dinosaur Cycler to reanimate. And this deck has, I even think I would like a little bit more top end than I have. I have pretty good ways to close out the game, but in these decks, I believe you should lean a little bit towards more top end than not, which sounds weird. And I say that with the understanding, like we just talked about, like you really want all the, lots of cheap stuff, lots of stuff to keep you alive early. But the reason you want to lean towards more top end than not, I found, is there's a risk of controlling the game, putting all these defensive cards in your deck, and then not really amounting to much. Like, I've done some deck techs with some blue-black control decks where they even got better low-end than I did. They had, like, 2 Deadweights, maybe some more Marionettes. Really were not going to die early. But the way that they were closing the game were, like, 2 of the Dinosaur Cyclers, like the 7-mana 6/7 Ward 3 and a Rampaging Spiketail. And you need to guarantee inevitability better than that. And if you take nothing away from me talking about all these black cards, this is the main thing. So, a little impromptu quick hit section here. You want to think about, in any control deck, but just in these decks specifically, when you're going to be playing a 10, 11, 12 turn game. The core conceit of a control deck is as you get to the late game, you're going to be massively advantaged. And just surviving isn't good enough to be massively advantaged because, I've talked about this in the show before, but if you're not presenting threats and you just put, here's a big dummy, they're going to kill it because they're going to have removal spells in hand because you're not presenting threats. So, of course, they're going to have removal spells in hand. You need something more resilient. You need more grind. And when you're playing that 11, 12 turn game, you need to find ways and put ways in your deck to keep spending mana every single turn of the game. If you stop spending mana, you're not drawing cards, you're not playing these top end cards, your opponent's eventually going to draw their better cards. They're going to draw their removal spells, their bombs that they might have. And you put all this work of drafting and playing and surviving early. That was so much of what your game plan was building towards for what, right? So if you're not that experienced playing these decks, I would probably say lean a little bit more top end than you think you need. Like, I've got 7 cards here that are 5 mana or more, and that's pretty good. I've also got those icebergs, and I think a really good fix for this, and this is where this ties into the caves. Having a cave package like I have here not only enables stuff like Sinuous Benthesor, which draws a bunch of cards, but it means that you're drawing lands in the late game that draw you spells or help you cast spells. The hidden lands, Hidden Necropolis, Hidden Cataract. Your opponent's going to be drawing basics, so you're advantaged there. So that's really important, but also just getting these good top-end cards in your deck, like the Leech, like the Benthesor. So this is kind of how I like to employ caves and drafting caves into my drafts. I'm not a cave deck, necessarily. I just have a cave package that gives me inevitability in the late game. And then the green-black version of the deck I have here, it's not got nearly as much low end as I'd like. I only have like 5 2-drops, 2 Poison Dart Frogs, a Deadweight, and a Cenote Scout. So I've got some stuff in there, but really I should have more cheap stuff. I just didn't really see it in the draft. And then my top end is I've got 3 Gargantuan Leeches, I've got a cave package, 6 caves, 7 caves in there, a Cavern Stomper. I've got 2 field wipes in Terror Tide and Calamitous Cave-In. So that actually helped make up for the fact I didn't have many cheap things because if I was going to be behind early, which I was quite often, I still got to wipe the board and catch back up. And I want to show this deck most because it's another example of like the cave package. I don't think you should really think of yourself as like the cave deck necessarily, especially because sometimes that can lead to bad mana. But this is where I've been personally drafting caves, how I've been doing it, a little bit more of a package than a full deck. And so let's talk about caves just quickly. I think the 3 best cave payoffs are the Benthesor, the Sinuous Benthesor, that's the blue one that draws cards. Cosmium Confluence, which is the 5 mana rare that you can go search for caves or put 3+1/+1 counters on caves or destroy an artifact, and you can choose 3 of these modes. You can choose the same mode multiple times. And I think this card actually, it's not even really that much of a cave card. I've played this card in my deck with only 1 cave before. Now, that's in a deck with no self-mill, so you don't accidentally mill that cave. But if you think about this card as just, if I have my cave on the battlefield, it's a 5 mana 9/9. And if I don't have my cave on the battlefield, I go search for my cave, and it's a 5 mana 6/6, right? So the Cosmium Confluence, I think people look at it, it's like, oh, I have to be super heavy caves. This is actually the cave payoff that you need the least caves for, I believe. Now, I would like more caves. I'm not saying that's an ideal situation, but I don't think it's unplayable if you only have 1 or 2 caves. Ideally, even in that situation, you have 2 because you end up in these spots where it's like, I've got a cave and I want to crack it, but I know I can't crack it because then if I draw my Cosmium Confluence, it's really bad. But just pointing it out that you probably don't need as many caves as you think you do to play Cosmium Confluence. And then Gargantuan Leech. And I think part of the reason why I like these the best is because they're in the colors that I am for these grindy decks, right? I mean, these Sultai, blue-black, black-green decks. You don't really have to stretch your mana too much. And I think stretching your mana too much is one of the reasons why early on people were not doing very well with the cave decks, because there are a lot of colorless caves. There are the red and the white payoffs as well. Calamitous Cave on a Bat Colony. I think you really want to prioritize good mana over just all the cave payoffs. Like I said, more of a package, not like, well, I've just got all of the cave payoffs, 1 of each color. I've got to get the full 5-color spread. You can support that too if you've got Poison Dart Frogs or a lot of fixing. But I think a big trap you can fall into is just like, well, I'm doing caves, I should go all in. No, don't make your mana bad, right? Number 1 priority is make your mana good first. If your mana can support Bat Colony, Calamitous Cave, sure. But really, I would prioritize the Leech, Cosmium Confluence, and Sinuous Benthesor, because those are just easier to cast. And then just talking about the caves in general, the ones you want to prioritize are the common tap lands that sacrifice to discover, Those are great. Those give you colored manas. At rare, there's Sunken Citadel, which is the one that just comes in tapped. You choose a color. Captivating Cave, the one that filters your mana. That one's okay. Promising Vein, the kind of bad Evolving Wilds variant. The other ones I don't like so much. Pit Offering, that's the one that comes in tapped. Exile cards from a grave, and this land taps for the color of those cards that you exiled. I don't love this one because you don't want to exile your own graveyard. You also can't guarantee that you're gonna be able to fix the way you need to from using your opponent's cards. If you're going very deep, like you do end up in the mega cave deck, you can play Forgotten Monument, which is the cave that says all your caves are basically mana confluences. They tap to add a mana of any color you get to pay 1 life for, but that's only if you're going very, very deep. Even then, though, like paying 1 life to tap for a color of mana can be pretty painful. And then, of course, you've got the artifact creatures, Compass Gnome and Scampering Surveyor. These are both pretty good. Just kind of tie the room together, help get the colors that you need, help get your better caves. And that's where we're going to leave it for the black deck. So just overall, it's all about attrition. It's all about grinding, surviving. But then, remember, you have to figure out ways to be able to keep spending your mana. It could be card draw. It could be a mana sink. It could be the caves. It could be those cave payoffs, Sinuous Ventosaur that draws you cards. It's just something you need to keep in mind. And usually you'll hear myself, other content creators be like, oh, if you're playing a control deck, don't worry how you're going to win. I think that's not true for this. I think you do really have to figure out how you're closing the game because so many of the other cards in your deck are purely defensive. They're just there for keeping you alive and they don't convert into the late game very well. And just before we touch on some individual cards, I want to touch on the 3 oddball archetypes: green, white, black, white, and blue, green. I say they're a little bit oddball because there's not a ton of crossover between them and all the other archetypes. And these are mostly card quality decks. Like I was describing at the beginning of the episode where it's like, okay, you're going to move in if these colors are open. Don't be afraid to move into these decks. Even though blue-green's theme doesn't really play out very well, you can still have a good blue-green deck. I have a green-white deck that I actually am just playing right now, and I'm close to a trophy. And for those, once again, those who are not watching, I'll try to spell this out. But it's truly just a package of a bunch of good green and white cards. Like, I've got triple Poison Dart Frog, triple Petrify, triple Armored Kincaller. I've got a Kutziel, which is the green-white uncommon, triple Huatli's Final Strike. I didn't realize how many triples I had in this deck. But like 2 Pathfinding Axe Draws, 2 Cavern Stompers. You're thinking of this as a aggressive deck. And one of the cards that I wish I had more copies of is Staggering Size, the 2 mana +3/+3 and trample. I noted this card way back when we were doing the State of the Format review as a good card, a card that I think is pretty underrated, and honestly a card I think has stayed pretty underrated. I think more people have caught on to the fact that Staggering Size is a good combat trick and a good card, but if your deck is train wrecking, let me put it this way, if your deck is train wrecking, if you just pick up all the Staggering Sizes and some reasonable bodies, that's gonna be a pretty good deck, and I think that's how your green-white decks tend to operate a lot of the time. You're just like, alright, here's some stuff, here's some power and toughness, here's some tricks and removal spells. Like, it's pretty vanilla. You can lean into the Kutziel theme a little bit of augmenting your creatures. Of course, the combat tricks will help that, but stuff like the Explorer's Cache, which is the 2 mana artifact that comes with 2 counters, and you can put a counter on a creature by tapping it, and when a creature with a counter dies, you put it back on the cache. Or the Jade Seed Stones, the 4 mana artifact that puts +1/+1 counters on things. Like, those are all fine things to do. But when it comes down to it, this is a very vanilla deck that just is classic Magic, limited Magic. It's effective. Not saying it's bad to be vanilla, but there's nothing really special going on aside from that little, Kutziel synergies going on here and there. One little combo I will call out is the combo of Kinjali's Dawnrunner and Staggering Size. So the Dawnrunner is the 3 mana uncommon explore creature with double strike. So you can set up a pretty good turn. You'll deal like 10 damage or something. It's just a bunch of damage out of nowhere. I've got combo kills, quote-unquote combo kills with the card where I've just had 2 Staggering Sizes and I just killed my opponent from 12. So that's just a little thing to look for. You're gonna find these small synergies here and there, right? I'm not saying this deck is devoid of synergies, but if you just figured out that green and white were open, or you opened a good green bomb and white happened to be open, you can pretty safely draft this deck by just being like, hey, the cards I know that are good in green and the cards I know that are good in white, let's just smash them together. I don't think you're going to find yourself in this deck very often, or the other decks that we're about to talk about. The main thing I want to point out is that at this stage of the format and in the open, if you're drafting in the open, don't be afraid to get into them because it's a quote-unquote bad color combination. That matters a lot less when you're in a competitive setting where you're just kind of scrapping out trying to get the good cards in your deck. You can't be too picky about it, right? This is still going to be a functioning Magic deck. You don't need to have that blue-red deck to compete. if green and white are open, you're going to have a pretty good deck. Blue-green's kind of the same kind of stuff. Like, I think this is also, like, a pretty aggressive deck. You're just attacking. You got your flyers in blue. You've got your big green creatures. And I think this deck can lean into, like, the Explore theme once in a while with Nick Zeal and Merfolk Cave Diver, which is the uncommon 2/4 that when you explore, it gets +1/+0 and it can't be blocked. Those are going to be, like, incidental synergies, though. Like, the green-blue deck I have in front of me, which is actually very kindly provided by one of my patrons, Matt. He had this deck that trophied, looked really cool. A bunch of staggering sizes. Once again, like, this is actually the perfect illustration of what I was talking about. Just pair a bunch of staggering sizes with a bunch of decent creatures, right? We've got 3 kin colors in here. We've got some big green creatures. We also have this cool little combo that he pointed out to me with Zoetic Glyph, which is, of course, that mythic uncommon that turns your artifacts into 5/4s, plus Explorer's Cache, which is that uncommon I just talked about that puts counters on your creatures. If you put a Zoetic Glyph on an Explorer's Cache, it actually becomes a 7/5 because the Explorer Cache has the counters on it, right? So just a kind of cool little thing. This is just another deck just like green-white. I'm not saying you're going to get into it very often, but don't be afraid to pivot into it if you think you should. And then very quickly, just black-white. I don't have a great example, but all the stuff we were talking about with the Descend decks, blue-black and green-black, you can kind of do the same thing with black-white. I don't think you should lead into the sacrifice theme. I think most of the sacrifice cards are traps. Even the gold uncommon, Bartolome, like, that is a fine card, but you don't want to take that card and be like, oh, I'm going to be sacrificing, because so many of the sacrifice cards aren't good. Mephitic Draft, which is the 2-mana artifact that comes in and draws a card, loses a life, and when you sack it, it does the same thing. Glorifier of Suffering, that's the 3-mana 3/2 that you sack a thing to put 2 counters. Like, these cards just are not very good. The one time I think you could lean into the sacrifice theme is if you have Veto, which is the mythic, the 4/4 flyer. And even then, I wouldn't, like, take those bad cards, but then it's like, okay, then Bartolome gets a little bit better. Then you really prioritize Tinkerer's Tote. You should think generally, though, about black-white as just a control deck where you're just grinding, using the black cards to grind. White has some pretty good grindy cards too, or just good value cards like Tinkerer's Tote, Ultec Cloud Guard's totally fine, just makes 2 blockers, one of them being a flyer. And then you can finish the game out with Sandwings, honestly. The Soaring Sandwings, the white dinosaur cycler. It's a fine enough finisher. Obviously, you'd like the black rares like we were talking about, but the times that I have drafted black-white to reasonable success, it's been much more of a control deck, much more of that black deck mindset than anything close to sacrifice. All right, and as promised, we're going to close out today with just some notable cards, and specifically notable cards that probably are not on a lot of people's radars, ones that, again, are not cards you really had to play the first week of the format, but ones I have found some homes for in the right spot. So the first one I want to talk about is Abyssal Gorestalker. This is the 6-mana, 4/black, 6/6 at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices 2 creatures. This card does have a bit of a deck building cost. You do need good fodder. You don't want to just be sacrificing real creatures to it. So stuff like Skullcap Snail, the 2-mana 1/1 that makes your opponent exile a card from their hand. Synapse Necromage, this is the uncommon 3/1 that when it dies, you make 2 black fungus. And the main thing you want to do with the Gorestalker is you want to recur it a bunch, right? You want to really have it just grind your opponent into the dust. And just a nice little thing you can do is, with another chance, pick up a Gorestalker, pick up a Necromage, then you can just kind of do the whole thing. You only lose half of a card, they lose 2 cards. It's really, really good against some decks, like against like a green-red dino deck, where their creatures are all just really large, making them sacrifice 2 things are good. A little bit less good against, like, you know, a red-white deck where they might have some smaller creatures. But if you're in need of that top end that I was saying is so critical for the black decks, this is a fine way to go about it, and you'll often get these close to last pick. Next up, we've got Twists and Turns, which isn't a horrible card by any means, but I think it's a card that's probably a little bit underrated. This is a single green mana enchantment at uncommon, sort of that explore build around that it explores when it enters, and then if you would explore, you instead scry one and then that creature explores. So you basically get to kind of get a little more selection on the thing you want to see on top, which is very nice because that's one of the main things I don't like about Explorer, where it's like, sometimes you really need that land, or sometimes you really need that counter. So this helps alleviate some of the variance there. But it also says when you hit your 7th land, this thing flips into a land itself, a cave for what it's worth. It taps to add green, and then has the ability 3 and a green to tap it. Look at the top 4 cards of our library. You can take a creature from among them. And this is another great way to grind out the game, especially in those green-black decks. But in any kind of mid-rangey looking green deck, I'd be pretty happy to play this card. This is the kind of card that those blue-black decks I was talking about really doesn't want to see, because it's a value engine that's pretty hard to interact with. This is where the secret mode of Ray of Ruin, or that sneaky mode of Ray of Ruin, comes in, where you can actually exile a non-basic land. I have done that before. Doesn't feel great, but you got to do what you got to do. So yeah, again, not a bad card, but I think one that is probably a little bit under the radar still. Up next, we've got Walk with the Ancestors, which is is 4 and a green for a sorcery. Return up to 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, then you discover 4. Just another card that kind of falls in the same camp of if you need some grind, this is a perfectly acceptable thing to have. Having self-mill means you can get back a pretty impactful target without needing to cast it first, and it making its way to the graveyard. So you do probably want this more in a deck with self-mill. Ultech Archaeologist. This is one that I've actually liked pretty much all format, and I feel like I like it more than most people do. This is the 5 mana 4/4 in white that you can either, when it enters, either choose to return an artifact from the graveyard to your hand or scry 3. This is a blue-white card, right? And a lot of times you have artifacts that go to the graveyard pretty readily, either artifact creatures or Tinkerer's Totes, or maybe you have a bit of self-mill and you just happen to have some cards that make their way to the graveyard. This is a good value card, right? If you're playing the long game, if you need top end, you know, all the stuff I was talking about with the black Descend decks where they need to find ways to keep spending mana in the late game. Same is true for blue-white, but I don't really make as much of a point about it when thinking about blue-white because blue-white's got really good ways to spend its mana naturally. All the craft cards do that for you. They're good early and good late. But say you find yourself in a blue-white silver deck and maybe only have 2 craft cards or something, Archaeologist is another pretty good way to get some grind in there. 2 cards here to close out on both for those grindy Descend decks. Frilled Caveworm. This is the 4 mana 2/5 that if you have Descend 4 becomes a 4/5. I don't hate this card. I don't love it, but I think it's still serviceable, and you get it for pretty much free. You get a last pick a lot of the time, and in a competitive draft setting or just in a late format draft setting, getting a solid playable card for free, you know, it's something to note. And then my last one, I actually do actively like this card, Primordial Gnawer. So this is the 5 mana 4 and a black 5/2. Then when it dies, you discover 4. I really love this card. So what happens often in those black decks, again, you're just gumming up the ground early, and then you play the Gnawer, and any thought of them attacking into you just goes, well, I don't want to do that anymore because this will trade for their best thing and then give you some value, discover 3. This might be like the most improved card in my mind on this list, where before I was like, oh, you know, really clunky 5/2, I don't want that. But just like the Frilled Caveworm that we just talked about, you get this card close to last pick. Not a lot of people have it on their radar, and I don't know if anybody has played this card, you might have felt this the same way too, but it just feels good to cast. It feels you have that inflection point in the game where you cast it and your opponent goes, huh, yeah, what do I do about that? Or they kind of just pause. I've had opponents like, they think and they think and they think and they think, and then they eventually kill it with a removal spell, and then I discover into a solid blocker, and it's like, well, yeah, you kind of have to do that there, because what else are you going to do? But it really does cause a lot of problems for your opponent, and not a bad card to recur too, right? Where you're always in the market for cards that are good to get back from the graveyard, because the cards that give you value in your black decks, and Gnawer is a fine way to do that. All right, and that's, my friends, we'll close this out here for today. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed this. If you're playing in the open, I wish you well. If you're not playing in the open, you're just planning to still jam some Ixalan on the ladder, I also wish you well. Join us in a week or a week and a half. We're going to be revving up the content for Lost Caverns of Ixalan coming up. Nope, that's not it. We're going to be revving up the content for Murders at Karlov Manor. That's what the set's called. We're not going back to Ixalan, I promise. So thank you so much once again. We'll see you next time.